Have you ever walked into a luxurious room, invitation in hand, only to realize within seconds you weren't welcome? The stares, the hushed laughter behind your back, the icy tone of the receptionist that makes you wonder, did I walk through the wrong door? Or is it simply that this skin was never meant to walk in at all? That is the quiet pain of countless Black people in America, not because of a lack of talent, not because of a lack of achievement, but because in the eyes of others they have never truly belonged. Every step into spaces of power comes at the cost of 1,000 condescending glances. And in that moment, you realize humiliation doesn't always come from a slap to the face. It comes from a laugh that lingers across the whole room. But today's story doesn't end there, because sometimes out of humiliation grows a deeper hunger. The hunger to see justice take its rightful place. The hunger for the day when the very chair once denied becomes a throne in the hands of the excluded. And that is the journey of Elijah Carter, a Black CEO who was humiliated at the gates of the city's most prestigious country club. 2 hours later, that very place trembled with applause as they welcomed him as their new chairman. A flip of the board so sharp it left the entire room in silence. A silence louder, heavier, and more powerful than any shouted reply. Before we begin this journey, if you've ever witnessed or lived through injustices like this, hit like, share this story, and subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell, because every story told here isn't just for listening. It's meant to awaken, to remind us that silence itself can be a form of power. And now, let's return to that very afternoon, when Elijah Carter held a gold-embossed invitation in his hand. Yet at the gilded gates, he was treated like an intruder. The sun was sinking behind the neatly trimmed hills, casting the lawn in a golden wash, like honey spilling across the grass. The country club rose in the distance, imposing, proud in the sunset glow, rows of polished white columns, marble steps gleaming so bright you could see your reflection in them. It radiated the cold authority of the elite, as if its doors had never been built to open for anyone but themselves. Elijah Carter stopped at the base of the steps. In his hand was the invitation, heavy cardstock, silver-embossed lettering, the red seal unmistakable. He had been invited here clearly, officially. Yet the air around him whispered a warning. His footsteps, though sanctioned, would not be welcomed. The receptionist glanced down at the invitation, then back up, her eyes lingering on his face longer than necessary. That hesitation said it all. Are you sure you belong here? From inside, laughter floated out, voices bouncing beneath the vaulted ceiling. Men in golf jackets, women draped in pearls, the easy atmosphere of those convinced the world was made to serve them. Elijah adjusted his tie, not to impress, but to steady his own heartbeat. He wasn't a man easily shaken. He had stood in boardrooms where millions were decided in a single sentence. But this was a different chill. Not loud, not blunt. Coated instead in a polite veneer, like a fine cup of tea laced with poison. The receptionist's smile was thin, fragile as paper. "I'm sorry, sir, but could I see some additional identification? Perhaps a membership card?" An absurd request. The chairman's signature sat plainly on the card, the seal clear and unmistakable. Elijah gave a small laugh, not of amusement, but of disbelief. "This invitation is proof enough." His voice was calm, but she hesitated still. The silence stretched, turning into a scene. From behind, a man in a pastel sweater strolled past, glanced at Elijah, and muttered just loud enough, "The paper delivery's around the side entrance." The receptionist let out a brittle chuckle, treating it like a clever joke. Elijah stayed perfectly still, the invitation still in her hand. Sunlight caught the bronze of his skin, making it glow like hammered metal. The marble steps under his feet gleamed like a row of mocking teeth. The message in the air was mercilessly clear. "You don't belong here." Elijah leaned slightly toward the desk, lowering his voice until only she could hear. "You've seen the name. Announce it." Not loud, not angry, just firm enough to turn doubt into an order. The receptionist, startled, pressed a buzzer. The doors swung open with a dry groan, like a reluctant sigh. Elijah walked in, shoulders squared, invitation slipping back into his pocket. No smile, but a thought flashed sharp as glass in his mind. A place that greets you with suspicion is already trembling at your presence. And beyond those doors, sharper humiliations waited, as if the entire room had agreed to remind him, you will never belong here. But that very night, they would learn a lesson they never expected. The door closed behind him. Elijah stepped into the grand hall blazing with light. Glasses clinked, jazz murmured as if to drown out whispers. But the air was thick with distance. Every glance that flicked his way carried something. Curiosity, disdain, or worse, indifference. As if he were an extra piece of furniture dropped into the polished scenery. He made his way to the guest list posted at the reception desk. The woman there frowned at his approach. Elijah handed her the invitation. She flipped it over, held it up to the light as if hunting for forgery. "Do you have a passport, sir? Or perhaps a membership card?" Her words sounded polite, but her doubt was naked. Elijah met her eyes, calm but cutting. "The invitation has the signature and the seal. That's proof." His tone was measured. Still, she pushed. At that moment, a man in a crisp polo with a sweater draped casually over his shoulders strolled by. He sized Elijah up, then let out a laugh. "Looks more like a flyer distributor than a guest." Laughter bubbled from those nearby, as though it was the wittiest remark of the evening. Elijah did not move. He let the laughter echo. He let the cheap contempt wash over him. No anger showed on his face, only a composure so steady that the chuckles soon rang hollow, dragged out and awkward. Sometimes silence is the sharpest rebuttal. The receptionist cleared her throat, hands trembling slightly as she returned the invitation. That gaze of his was harder to dismiss than she expected. Finally, she dialed the phone and her voice came slow, reluctant. "Guest, Elijah Carter?" The room paused just for a beat before the music swelled again, pretending nothing had happened. Elijah stepped forward, each stride solid, leaving behind eyes still smirking with disdain. But he knew. Their mockery did nothing to cheapen his invitation. It only revealed their fear. Because in a space designed to exclude, his very presence was proof that the walls were already cracking. He turned down the hallway toward the banquet hall. Golden light from the chandeliers spilled across white-draped tables. The setting was grand, opulent, but carried no warmth. Everything whispered, "You are an intruder, allowed in by mistake." Elijah drew a slow breath. He knew this was only the prelude. The real test waited inside, where the leather chairs would decide if he was worthy of sitting. He kept walking, aware of every gaze pricking his back. The thick carpet muffled his footsteps, but the air reeked of control. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of white men in suits, gazes stern, claiming a future they believed was theirs alone. Then the banquet hall opened before him. Laughter faltered like a song cut off mid-note. A server turned quickly away, too slow to hide the flicker of scrutiny. Elijah scanned the room, looking for his table. According to the list, he was assigned to table 3, near the stage. A spot important enough to prove the invitation was no mistake. But when he approached, he froze. His chair, gone. The place where his name should be was empty. His name card had been shoved to the end of the table, wedged beside the server's station. Faces at the table feigned surprise, then broke into hushed chuckles. A gray-haired man smirked. Must have been a small mix-up. But there's a seat near the kitchen. Much more comfortable. The table erupted in laughter. No one said he couldn't sit there. But the act spoke louder than words. The chair removed, his name displaced. A public joke, gift wrapped in civility. Elijah stood still. He could have protested. It demanded fairness, but he didn't. He set his glass of water on the table, tapped a slow rhythm with his finger, then raised his head and met their eyes. In that silence, their laughter began to sound forced, brittle. His calm unsettled them. A pearl-draped woman quickly changed the subject, though her eyes lingered with curiosity. Elijah gave the faintest smile, not to join their game, but to draw a line. I am here, whether you like it or not. He walked past the table, ignoring the seat they'd tried to push on him. His steps cut like a silent blade through their masks of politeness. And in the narrator's voice, echoing in the listener's mind, came the toll of a heavy bell. This was not the first time a black man had to prove he had the right to stand in this room. But tonight, silence itself would sow the seeds of a storm. Elijah stepped through the wide-open doors of the banquet hall, where golden light from the chandelier spilled down like honey, flooding over tables draped in crisp white linen. The jazz band seemed to stumble for a beat, the notes faltering, mirroring the way every smile in the room froze at once. No one said it out loud, but their eyes said everything. Gaze after gaze slid over him with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. A few whispered behind their hands. A few chuckled softly, a private laugh, but not private enough to hide the delight they took in the spectacle. Elijah knew that look. He had carried it with him since childhood, in classrooms, in his first conferences, and now here, in this gilded chamber of yellow light. It hadn't changed. It had only grown more refined. He moved deeper inside, his breath steady. Every table glimmered with crystal glasses, polished silverware, tall bouquets of white roses, every detail flaunting the perfection of a world certain of its own power. But in that perfection, his presence appeared like a crack in the lacquered wall. A salt-and-pepper-haired man, impeccably groomed, looked Elijah over with a smirk. "Well, how interesting," he said to the woman beside him, loud enough for Elijah to hear. "Our club has become more open, hasn't it?" The woman laughed out loud, tugging her pearl shawl tighter as if to underline the jab. Elijah paused just for a beat. He didn't answer. He kept his eyes fixed on table 3 where his seat was supposed to be. His calm made their laughter echo strangely, bouncing hollow against the very walls that gave it shelter. The room grew heavy, as if everyone were waiting for his reaction. They wanted him to snap, to reject the invitation, to prove them right, that he was never worthy. But Elijah denied them that satisfaction. His eyes stayed steady, his shoulders squared, his steps unshaken. In that moment, the banquet's grandeur turned into a stage, and the people watching became unwitting actors in a comedy they didn't realize they were performing. Because Elijah understood, sometimes one calm step was enough to shake an entire arrogant room. And ahead, where his missing chair should have been, lay the clearest evidence of their petty charade. And there he would answer them, not with words, but with a silence strong enough to upend the evening. Elijah stopped at table 3. The name card with his printed letters still lay neatly on the white linen. But the chair that belonged there was gone, erased as if it had never existed. Every other seat was filled. His alone had been pulled away, an absence carved out deliberately. The man sitting nearest the gap offered a false chuckle. "Perhaps a small mistake, but Mr. Carter, the service table has plenty of chairs. They'd be happy to have you." He gestured toward the corner where staff stood waiting. The moment he spoke, the table burst into laughter, rippling outward like spilled oil, spreading across the room. The laughter wasn't loud enough to break the dinner, but it carried. Enough that everyone knew a little show was underway, and Elijah was its unwilling star. Some pretended to look away, but their eyes kept flicking back, eager to see what he would do. Elijah didn't sit. He stood tall, his gaze sweeping slowly over the faces watching him. There was no anger there, no weakness, only a stillness sharp enough to unsettle. He placed his glass of water on the table right in the space where the missing chair should have been, as if to declare, "I am here no matter how hard you try to erase me." A pearl-draped woman leaned back with a tinkling laugh. Well, you could always sit there for now. Who knows? Maybe in a few years you'll earn a real chair. Her voice was a needle aimed to pierce. Elijah didn't answer. His silence shifted the air. What had been playful laughter now sounded hollow, recycled, brittle. Smiles froze on faces, stiffening into discomfort. Because nothing unsettles a mocker more than the refusal to become the punchline. Elijah gave the faintest nod, lips curving in the thinnest smile, not to join them, but to draw a boundary. He would not be pulled into their game. He stepped back once, but not toward the server's table as they hoped. He remained standing, letting his presence transform the empty chair into a glaring monument of their own pettiness. The noise of the hall resumed, but beneath it, tension grew. What had begun as a harmless joke now stood exposed as a mirror, reflecting their smallness. And in that extravagant room, it was the empty space at table 3, the absence that became the most conspicuous, unbearable detail. Elijah knew. This was not the climax. The humiliations would continue, more elaborate, more public. But he also knew every laugh tonight would soon curdle into the most awkward silence they had ever endured. He stood there, calm amid the mingled music and muffled laughter. He didn't rush to reply. He didn't look for another seat. They waited, almost hungry for him to lash out, to speak up, to add fuel to the performance. He didn't give them that. He lifted the glass of water, the clear surface trembling only with the rhythm of his steady pulse. Elijah raised it to eye level as if performing a ritual only he understood. He touched the rim lightly to his lips, sipped, then set it back down on the table, directly in front of the missing chair. The room faltered. Faces shifted, unsettled. A gesture so simple yet heavy with meaning. Elijah didn't need a chair, didn't need permission. By placing his glass there, he made his presence undeniable, carved into the fabric of the evening. A man at the table laughed too loudly, desperate to break the silence. Well played, Carter. But, most of us aren't used to standing for long. We sit here, while you, it seems, choose otherwise. The jab carried mockery and challenge, but the strain in his tone betrayed the unease. Elijah turned his head, his eyes calm, unreadable. He didn't speak. He simply lifted the glass again, tilting it slightly like a silent toast. His silence became a slap no hand could deliver. Not passive, but the silence of someone who knew exactly where he would stand in the game. Around him, bodies shifted restlessly. Spoons clinked against plates. Chairs scraped against marble. A clumsy soundtrack for Elijah's composure. He remained unmoved, a fixed point while the room scrambled to maintain its charade of ease. The pearl-draped woman sipped her wine, glanced his way, then quickly looked down. Perhaps she realized the joke they thought they'd crafted had turned into a mirror, reflecting their own smallness. And once recognized, laughter turns bitter. Elijah didn't need to speak. Because some responses don't require sound. They echo in the unease of those who once believed they owned the stage. His smile was thin, sharp as a razor. He raised the glass one last time. It was a declaration without words. I am here, and my presence alone is enough to shift the room. And the narrator's voice closed in, leaving a lingering resonance like a prophecy. Some chairs are denied to you, until the moment the entire room belongs to you. As the dinner gradually found its rhythm again, silverware chiming softly, low laughter rippling, a figure peeled away from the crowd and headed straight for Elijah. It was a familiar face. Marcus Lane, one of the few black men Elijah had once partnered with on a tech deal years back. Back then, Marcus had told him with fierce conviction, "We'll prove people like us can break down any door." Yet tonight, Marcus wore a kind of polished kindness, like glossy varnish hiding the cracks beneath. He set a hand on Elijah's shoulder, his grin stretched wide enough to serve as armor. "Elijah," Marcus said, voice pitched just low enough. My man, I think you should leave. Don't make this harder on yourself. Elijah looked him in the eye and saw none of the old fire. Only caution, the quiet hunger to be accepted by keeping his head down. He said nothing, but the thin smile on his lips made Marcus flinch. Marcus's words sounded like concern, but Elijah knew better. It wasn't advice, it was surrender. A blade wrapped in velvet, driven from behind. What made it sting wasn't who said it, it was that he said it. A man who'd once stood beside him at the start. Marcus dropped his voice further, as if to smother his own shame. You know, they never really wanted us here. Choose your exit with dignity. Don't make yourself more of a spectacle. Elijah set his water down and tilted his head with a small smile. Not agreement, not mockery. More like a sigh given shape. A smile that told Marcus there was now a distance between them no bridge could cross. No raised voice, no rebuttal. Elijah knew some betrayals aren't worth the breath. Silence is the heaviest sentence. Marcus slid his hand off Elijah's shoulder, the earlier warmth curdling into an awkward frown. He turned and slipped back into the crowd, leaving Elijah where he stood, a proud silhouette that needed neither a chair nor permission. And as the air settled, the narration cut through like a warning. Sometimes the worst betrayal doesn't come from a stranger, right? But from the one who once swore to walk with you to the end. Marcus leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Elijah could hear. Elijah, go. Don't make this harder on yourself. Those words fell like a dull, heavy blade, not cutting skin, but crushing something inside. Elijah blinked at the face that once fought alongside him. The same mouth that had once talked about changing the game, tearing down invisible walls, now urging retreat, as if Elijah's very presence were an embarrassment. In that instant, Elijah understood. Open enemies are easier than a brother who chooses the side of power. Betrayal from within always lands deeper. Marcus glanced around and pressed on, almost pleading as if offering mercy. They're waiting to see how you react. Don't give them a reason. If you walk out now, at least you keep some face. Face. The word slapped him, but Elijah didn't show it. He let Marcus see a face smooth as stone. No crack, no ripple. Because he knew, keeping face isn't about bowing. It's about standing steady while the whole room laughs. Elijah rested a hand on Marcus's shoulder, not gripping, just a touch. A silent reminder. I hear you, I'm not going anywhere. Marcus stiffened. The pleasant smile warped, then slipped. He eased his shoulder free, eyes unsettled, and hurried back to the safety of polished laughter and canned praise. Elijah stayed put, lifted his glass, and took a sip, as if no blade had just lodged between his ribs. Because he knew, betrayal only clarifies the obvious. He was aimed in the right direction, and his presence was what rattled them. Around the table, a few onlookers watched with satisfied eyes, assuming Elijah had been diminished by his ally. But they missed the truth. His silence wasn't a bow. It was the opening move of a larger reversal. The narration stretched out, leaving a lingering hum. Some knives from behind make you buckle. Others make you stand taller because you know the whole room is about to witness the truth. Marcus waited, expecting Elijah to argue, to flare, to prove he still had fight. Elijah did none of it. He simply looked at Marcus, calm to the point of unreadable, and gave a single nod. A short nod, neither assent nor refusal. A wall of quiet erected in one motion. Marcus edged back, wrong-footed by a gesture too simple to parse. In Elijah's stillness, Marcus saw himself reflected. His own choice to bow was exposed, no words required. The air between them thickened. Nearby guests had caught enough of the exchange to smirk. Nothing pleased them more than watching two men of the same color fail to stand together. It tidied the narrative that Elijah didn't belong. Marcus forced a crooked smile, turned, and vanished into the river of pale suits and clinking glass. Elijah didn't look after him. He rolled the water in his glass, listening to the faint crackle of melting ice. Small sound. In this room, sharp as a pin. He understood. Pain doesn't always come from strangers' jeers. It's the friend who once swore to break the wall, now settling in as one more brick, that cuts deepest. But he also knew this betrayal wouldn't make him bend. It gave him one more reason to stand, to prove, through presence alone, that the road could not be closed. The room resumed its confident chatter, laughter, talk, the bright click of glass. But where Elijah stood, a dense hush hovered around him. It forced passers-by to glance twice, to register that his silence wasn't defeat, it was a countdown. Elijah lifted his chin, serenity bright in his eyes, and set the glass back on the table, right where the missing chair should be. No speech, no argument. One small act, enough to show he had not been removed. And the narration closed, leaving a clean, deep cut. Sometimes betrayal from the familiar hurts more than 100 insults from the strange. The chime of a spoon against crystal glass rang out, rippling through the hall like a signal for silence. The former chairman of the club, Mr. Whitmore, silver hair slicked back, a black suit hugging his tall, lean frame, rose deliberately. He lifted a glass of red wine, the liquid catching the chandelier's glow, and spoke in a voice polished by countless rehearsals in front of a mirror. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his smile curling with self-satisfaction, "we gather again in this place that has preserved our values for generations. A place not everyone can enter. A place reserved, yes, only for those truly worthy." The room nodded as one. A few polite claps punctuated the air as if the line had just affirmed their exceptional status. But Elijah heard the undertone immediately. Every word wasn't only about tradition. Each one was a blade aimed squarely at his presence. The man who did not belong. Whitmore swirled his wine, eyes sweeping the tables before fixing, unflinching, on Elijah. He never said the name, but the gaze made it clear. "This tradition endures," he continued, "because we protect it. We do not open doors simply because someone wishes to walk in. This is a fortress of class, of selectivity, of a heritage that cannot be diluted." A ripple of knowing laughter spread. A few glasses lifted in a mock toast, pledges disguised as camaraderie. Elijah stood firm, eyes steady on the podium. There was no outward defiance, only a silence so deep it turned Whitmore's confidence brittle, making the approving smiles falter on their faces. Whitmore's speech droned on like a one-man play. Founding fathers, original values, the purity of the club. Each phrase heavy, each word wrapped in civility but thrown like stones at the one man singled out by silence. Around him the members, white and comfortable, chuckled softly, smug in their fortress of words. To them, Whitmore's phrases were the walls that kept order intact. To Elijah, every word was a test. How would he respond to this veiled public humiliation? He didn't move. He didn't blink. He lifted his glass of water, swirling it until the light fractured across the table like cracked glass. In that stillness, his presence itself became the counterpoint. If their tradition was truly so strong, why repeat it like a prayer, trembling at the fact that one man's presence made it quiver? Whitmore closed with a toast. "Let us raise our glasses to values that never fade." Crystal lifted, but in that moment it felt like theater. Behind the curtain, the real storm was forming. As his words ended, Whitmore turned, locking his gaze, pointed, deliberate, on Elijah. No longer the gaze of a host, but the thrust of a knife aimed at the only black man in the room. The room fell still. And then, on cue, laughter erupted. Not laughter of joy. Sharp, synchronized, swelling into a chorus of derision. Glasses clinked, the sound like bells of victory. The victory was obvious. They believed they had once more put someone back in his place. Elijah didn't flinch. He stood tall, glass in hand, unmoved, and his silence only made the laughter swell, as though they needed their noise to drown out the unease his calm created. Then the cruelty spread further. Waitstaff, who had until now glided politely, shifted tone. One young server set a tray down too hard, spilling a trickle of wine, and shot Elijah a look stripped of courtesy. Another smirked as he turned away, moving slow enough to flaunt his disdain. Someone's voice rang out, half joke, half jab. "Looks like we're short on pourers tonight. Maybe Mr. Carter can help." The spark touched dry tinder. Laughter boomed louder. Elijah said nothing. He set his water down, eyes following the ripples inside the glass as though immune to the racket. But that very gesture became his retort. In a room filled with forced mirth, he was the still point, and stillness at times unsettles more than any shout. Faces began to twitch. Smiles warped. The longer they laughed, the hollower it sounded. Some glanced sideways, unease creeping in, afraid perhaps that his calm was sharper than any outburst. Whitmore sipped his wine, lips tight, eyes locked on Elijah, but he didn't realize his speech had already collapsed. Nothing unmasks false grandeur faster than when the crowd reveals itself as the farce. Elijah brushed a fingertip against his glass, lips curving in the faintest smile as if memorizing the moment. Every sneer, every laugh, they were already turning into evidence. And the narration lingered razor sharp. Some laughter doesn't lighten the room. It exposes fear. And when even the staff are given permission to mock, they reveal the cracks in a wall that once looked unbreakable. The hall gleamed like a stage. Golden lights, laughter, red wine glinting. But at its center sat Elijah, shoulders squared, gaze calm, turning their mirth into shrill noise. Whitmore muttered a few more lines about preservation, pride, tradition, but now it sounded like a tape on repeat. For every eye had shifted to the man who hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, yet made the whole room restless. Members fidgeted. Heads shook. Whispers flitted. Why is he still here? But Elijah did not waver. He raised his glass again, turned it slowly, scattering light across the table. Such a simple gesture, but in the thick air it declared, "I remain." Laughter sputtered back, but now defensive, brittle. Not mockery, but a choir trying to drown silence. And the silence still won. A server dropped a dessert plate too hard, earning a burst of chuckles. Elijah looked at him. Just one look, steady, unblinking, and the man faltered, retreating faster than before. In that instant, the balance tipped. They thought they mocked him, but it was his silence peeling off their mask. Elijah sat still, unmoving. And that, more than protest, was the act of power. In a world addicted to dominance through noise, silence cut deeper. It forced them to hear their own emptiness. Whitmore drank again, hand trembling. His closing words drew only scattered applause, thin and flat. For the room knew the authority they thought they displayed had exposed its fatal weakness. And the narration ended, ironic and searing. They thought they were telling a joke. In truth, they had just written their own obituary. The laughter in the hall hadn't fully died. It rippled in waves across the banquet tables. Thin, shallow currents of amusement. Glasses clinked, heads nodded, smiles spread in smug satisfaction at what they thought was a final victory. The intruder put back. In his place, Elijah sat upright, eyes steady. He slipped a hand into his jacket pocket and drew out his phone. The glow of the screen lit his face under the chandeliers, small but sharp, catching the notice of a few curious glances. While the room swam in laughter, his long fingers moved quietly, tapping out a few short, decisive lines. One message sent, then another. No one knew what words were leaving his phone. No one guessed the weight they carried. To the crowd, it was a nervous tick, an outsider hiding in a screen. But the truth was far from small. For Elijah, every word he typed wasn't for comfort. It was foundation. The first stone in a countermove that would flip the board. No spotlight, no applause. Just the silence of a man setting the trap. At a nearby table, a man raised his voice. Even when he's cornered, he reaches for his phone. Maybe he's calling a cab. The table roared with laughter. The jab flew across the air, brushed Elijah, and fell useless. He smiled faintly, eyes never lifting. His fingers kept moving, calm, measured, until the joke collapsed into silence. If anyone had been paying closer attention, they would have seen the paradox blooming. The whole room congratulated itself on its unity, while the only man alone was the one actually in control. But no one dared think it. To them, Elijah was just a misplaced guest, clinging to water instead of wine, a phone instead of fellowship. They didn't see it for what it was. Not surrender, but the knife inside its sheath. And when drawn, one cut would be enough to split the facade wide open. Elijah sent the final message, the screen dimming back into shadow. He lifted his head, eyes sweeping once across the hall. A handful of guests turned away too quickly. He set the phone on the table beside his half-empty glass. His composure, more than any defiance, became the irritant. The louder they laughed, the more that silence cut. And the narration whispered, "Sometimes battles don't begin with a shout. They begin with a message sent in silence. And when silence turns into a weapon, it cuts sharper than any sneer." At the far end of the corridor, a small door opened. A man in a gray suit slipped in, face unreadable, carrying a leather briefcase. He set it on a side table in the adjoining room. No one in the banquet noticed. All eyes were still locked on the theater of mockery at the center of the hall. The man was Elijah's lawyer. He needed no announcement, no applause. He simply opened the case and drew out a thick stack of documents. Heavy pages, black ink, bold and precise, lined like a verdict waiting to be read. He uncapped his pen and signed, each stroke slow, deliberate, irrevocable. Outside, the members laughed and toasted, smug in their illusion that Elijah sat cornered, alone. They didn't know that just a few steps away, the balance of power had already shifted. A staffer passing by glanced through the half-open door, saw the lawyer bent over the papers. He frowned, puzzled, but hurried on. In places like this, curiosity could be more dangerous than ignorance. At the table, Elijah turned his glass slowly, the liquid catching the light like fractured crystal. He didn't look toward the door, but his eyes glinted, as if he could feel every stroke of that pen. While the room roared, he alone knew. An earthquake was already rumbling beneath their feet. Any outside observer would have noticed the dissonance. A hall full of noise and yet a silent current running against it. The man mocked as an outsider was in truth authorizing his lawyer to sign over ownership of the very place that mocked him. That was the bitter irony. The loudest laughter always comes from the blindest audience. The final page was signed. The lawyer closed the file, slid the papers back into the case, and nodded at the floor manager who had slipped into the room. Just a nod, brief, heavy with consequence. The door shut softly, unnoticed by the crowd. Elijah took a sip of water, lips curving into a blade-thin smile. The banquet outside thought they were watching an opening act of humiliation. They didn't know the real play had already been written in ink. And the narration carried, low and cutting. While they laughed, the words on paper turned the board. The most dangerous silence is the one that signs the sharpest blade. The party spun on. Glasses lifted. Anecdotes flew. Laughter struck the vaulted ceiling like smug bells. They thought Elijah had been caged in his role. Silent, small, irrelevant. But he sat unmoving, statue still. Every gesture paired to its minimum. A raised glass, a slow turn, a steady gaze. In their frenzy, they mistook his stillness for absence. In truth, his refusal to play was the act that ended the game. Next door, the documents rested heavy in their case, fresh ink still drying. Pages strong enough to tilt the hall itself. Yet inside, they toasted victory, oblivious to the fact that the war was already decided and lost. Elijah raised his eyes, scanning the hall. He didn't single anyone out, but the calm in his gaze felt like a mirror. A few guests flinched, eyes dropping to their plates, their laughter fractured. His silence had become the one voice they could not ignore. A man at a nearby table forced a joke. "Carter looks like he's calculating the price of that water glass." Laughter sputtered, uneven. A few weak claps. The orchestra of mockery had lost its timing. Elijah sipped slowly, placed the glass back exactly in place. The gesture, trivial in any other setting, here landed like the final period at the end of a too long sentence. He didn't need words. His composure had already spoken. Small silences began creeping in between bursts of laughter, growing longer, spreading wider. A cold draft of unease moved through the hall, and slowly they began to understand. In a room where volume once meant power, silence had become absolute. Elijah sat still, expression unreadable. But it was precisely that blankness that drew every eye back to him. And the narration settled, heavy and deliberate. Some battles are not won with shouts, but with signatures in silence. The laughter hadn't even faded when the ballroom doors suddenly swung open. A floor manager hurried in, his face pale, suit buttons misaligned from his rush. In his arms he clutched a thick folder, the papers trembling with each hurried step. The room, still drunk on its own victory, lifted its head as one. That disheveled figure was a blot of ink bleeding across the pristine carpet of the evening. "Mr. Whitmore?" His voice quavered, slicing through the ballroom's hush. There's something you need to see. Right away." Whitmore frowned, annoyed that his triumph had been interrupted. He motioned the man closer, snatched the folder, and scanned the pages. His eyes darted, then froze. His pupils tightened. The hand that had always seemed so steady began to tremble. In his other hand, the red wine quivered, threatening to spill. Nearby members leaned in, trying to catch a glimpse, but saw nothing. Only heard the manager's ragged whisper. "Sir, the ownership has changed." In that instant, the ballroom felt stripped of air. Silence spread like a crack across glass. All eyes locked on the podium. Even the jazz band fell mute, as if they too sensed a tremor splitting beneath the floor. Elijah sat calmly where he was. He didn't rise, didn't claim the stage. Everything that needed to be said was already written on those trembling sheets. He swirled his water glass, letting the chandelier fracture across its rim, his silence cutting sharper than any speech. From a nearby table, someone muttered loud enough for others to hear, "What is it? Why does he look like he's seen a ghost?" No answer came. Faces turned only toward Whitmore, his confidence bleeding away, flushed pink to chalk white, then ashen gray. He tried to smile. His lips twitched into a crooked arc, grotesque in its weakness. That broken smile was the tolling bell. The game had flipped. Elijah set his glass down gently. No remarks, no gestures of triumph. Yet his composure poured oil onto the fire of unease. The room shifted, murmurs grew, chairs scraped, silverware clattered. Pride that had filled the air minutes earlier shattered like crystal on marble. And the narration carved through, dry, cutting. While they thought they were still toasting, one trembling file of paper turned laughter into deadly silence. Sometimes news doesn't arrive like an invitation. It arrives like a knife into the gut of pride. The whispers swelled, thick and nervous. Eyes begged Whitmore for reassurance, for order. But the pillar of the club now sagged as if the ground itself were slipping beneath him. The manager drew a breath, voice breaking. According to the most recent and legally confirmed filings, Mr. Elijah Carter is now the largest shareholder of this country club. The room froze. Utterly. The laughter of minutes before crashed to pieces. Guests stared at one another, searching for denial, and found only the same blank fear reflected back. A woman dropped her silver spoon. Its metallic clink rang out like a gunshot in the thick silence. A man shook his head over and over. Others, the loudest laughers of earlier, now bowed into their glasses, dodging the reflection of their own faces in the wine. Elijah sat motionless. He didn't rise to collect their acknowledgement. He simply rotated the glass in his hand, shards of light scattering across the tablecloth, like forcing the room to confront itself in a mirror of truth. Someone whispered, weak but carrying, "Impossible." But the denial only underlined the truth pressing down on them. The man they had mocked now wielded the greatest power within their proud fortress. Whitmore cleared his throat, voice fraying, "There must be some mistake in the process." But the manager raised the file higher, his own hands shaking. Everything is legal. The documents cannot be reversed. Defeat saturated the air. Those polished leather chairs, once thrones, now felt like restraints. Every laugh from earlier returned like damning evidence of their blindness. Elijah raised his glass, took a sip, set it down as softly as a falling feather. But in the heavy quiet, the sound echoed like a bell toll. And the narration pressed blade sharp. With one announcement, laughter collapsed. The room realized the man they had cast as a joke was the one holding life and death. Sometimes a single cold sheet of paper can bury an entire smug tradition. The ballroom sagged under silence. This space that had thrummed with music and chatter was now heavy, breathless. Guests fidgeted, fingers twined, searching for gestures to cover the awkwardness. The harder they tried, the more their discomfort showed. A cough here, another there. One man raised his glass, hoping to spark applause. The sound faltered midair and died. Smiles warped at the edges, spreading nowhere, cracking the room further. Elijah remained seated. He didn't need a microphone. He didn't need to speak. Power had shifted, out of speeches and rehearsed toasts into presence itself. His quiet became the axis of the room. A woman whispered, stunned. How, in just 2 hours? No one answered. The words smashed against the very wall they had trusted for years. The naked truth was now plain. While they laughed, the man they dismissed bought the game outright. Whitmore slammed his glass onto the table. Red wine splattered like thin blood across the rim. His mouth opened, but no words remained. Each furrow in his brow only confirmed what all already knew. The crown was no longer his. The staff, who had smirked before, now kept their eyes lowered, feet quick, lips sealed. They knew too well. Mocking a guest is play, mocking the new owner is suicide. Elijah raised his glass one more time. Not to boast, not to toast, but as a ritual reminder, sometimes victory isn't fireworks. It is silence that makes a room choke on itself. At last they understood. His quiet wasn't lack of reply. It was the fiercest reply. It forced them all to confront their own reflection. And the narration lingered, slow and merciless. In 2 hours, the man they dismissed became the shadow that covered the entire room. The air in the ballroom hung heavy, as if every laugh from earlier had turned into stone, pressing down on each chest. Whitmore, the ousted chairman, tried desperately to salvage what scraps of authority remained. He cleared his throat, the wine glass still trembling in his hand, and stepped forward, his eyes deliberately fixed on Elijah. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice raspy but forced into a veneer of ceremony, "the tradition of this place has always demanded not only power but proof. And perhaps for all of us to see clearly, Mr. Carter will want to say a few words. An opportunity to prove he truly deserves this position." The whole room turned toward him. The scattered gazes realigned, converging. To them, this was their chance to force Elijah onto the stage, to make him speak, to reveal a crack. Silence unsettled them, but a speech could be picked apart, dissected. Whispers rippled. "Let's hear what he says." Will he even dare to stand up? Under the golden light, the ballroom transformed into a courtroom, and Elijah, seated calmly, was cast in the role of the unspoken defendant. Elijah remained still. He placed a hand on his glass of water, turned it slowly, eyes following the tiny spiral on the clear surface. No rush, no panic, only a composure so unnerving that it made others restless. Whitmore pressed on, his tone sharpening, a sugary command cloaked as invitation. "Mr. Carter, this is your chance. Tell us how you deserve that chair." A few nervous laughs escaped. Some clapped lightly, trying to manufacture rhythm. But every eye pinned itself to Elijah because his silence had become the most intolerable wound they wanted exposed. Elijah raised his head. His eyes swept across the hall, not fast, not slow. Faces that met his gaze flinched and quickly looked away, as though their mask had been stripped bare. He lifted the glass, brought it gently to his lips, drank, and set it down. His hand was steady, not a single word left his mouth. A word. The silence stretched. At first seconds, then a minute. Long enough for whispers to sour into unease, for cough to scatter across the room, for elegance to rot into a collective awkwardness. Elijah stayed exactly as he was. No nod, no shake of the head, no broad smile, no furrowed brow. Only his presence sitting like a mirror propped before the entire hall, forcing everyone to look at themselves. And the narration rose, slow and cutting. They invited him to stand and prove he was worthy. But when he stayed seated, they began to realize his silence was the loudest proof. The room held its breath. Every gaze fastened on Elijah, anticipating the moment he would leap up and deliver a fiery speech, staking his claim with words. In their minds, no new chairman would squander such a golden chance to give a speech, to prove himself in rhetoric. They wanted to hear his journey, to hear fire-forged words, to see him hoist himself into a flag they could both revere and try to tear down. They craved the theatrics, so they could respect him and then dismantle him. Elijah stood, slowly, deliberately, with no urgency, enough to make every eye tighten with expectation. A few scattered claps broke out, hopeful he was about to speak. The ballroom fell silent, hearts thudding in chests. But he did not step to the podium. He did not reach for the microphone. Instead, Elijah simply stood tall, scanning the rows. His gaze never lingered long, but enough for each person to feel pierced, as though weighed and measured. No words. Yet the stillness pressed down until the air itself grew thin. One man whispered, voice shaky, "Why hasn't he said anything?" The neighbor pressed lips tight, unwilling to answer. Elijah moved forward, not to the podium, but to the chairman's seat at the head table. He paused, fingertips brushing the back of the chair, as if considering. The room froze, convinced this would be the prelude to a thunderous declaration. But no. Elijah merely turned, sat in the chair, utterly calm. He set his hand on the table, lifted the water glass, drank a small sip. Not a single word, not a single justification. The silence exploded like a voiceless thunderclap. In that instant, everyone understood. Elijah didn't need to speak. Sitting down was the speech, a speech shorter than any sentence, stronger than any oration. Whitmore's knuckles whitened around his wine glass, his face twisted. The members sat rigid, bewildered, like actors stripped of their script. The stage had inverted. The man they demanded prove himself had silently claimed the highest seat. And the narration lingered, biting, icy. They waited for a blazing speech, but he only stood, looked, and sat. Sometimes sitting in the rightful chair is the loudest declaration. Elijah sat in the chairman's chair with no fanfare, no loud scrape of wood, no triumphant nod. He sat as if it had been his all along, as if tonight he had merely come back to take his place. The room, though packed, suddenly felt hollow. The proud faces from minutes earlier were stiff now, uncertain, lost. A few clapped weakly, the sound thin, falling into the heavy air. Others forced smiles that sagged, masks slipping against the steel calm of Elijah. Whitmore still stood at the podium, his grip crushing the stem of his glass until his joints turned white. He had believed he could steer the scene, corner Elijah, force him into the trial of proving his worth. Instead, Whitmore himself stood unmasked. The room had waited for Elijah's words, but Elijah had none to give. His silence was his manifesto. A woman coughed, hoping to puncture the stillness. It only made the quiet sharper. A man leaned to whisper to his neighbor, only to fall mute when Elijah's gaze swept past. The jazz, once lilting in the background, had stopped. Even the band was trapped inside the silence of power. Only hearts pounding filled the space, now thick with storm. Elijah raised his glass, drank again, tapped a finger lightly against the wooden table. The sound was faint, only those near could hear, but in this silence it echoed like the rhythm of a funeral march. Not his funeral. The old regime's. A few more claps sputtered into life, weaker still. People clapped not to celebrate, but to soothe their own discomfort. Yet the truth loomed. Those claps were no longer applause. They were late, reluctant acknowledgments that everything had changed hands. Elijah set his glass down, eyes forward. No smile, no frown. And that composure itself made the room understand. They had lost, not to a speech, but to silence that overturned the board. And the narration closed, slicing slow. That was the moment the entire room understood. Those fragile claps weren't for Elijah, they were for their own defeat. The ballroom sank into a heavy silence. The people who had long ruled with laughter and proud nods now sat frozen, their faces stiff like wax figures. The crystal chandeliers still blazed above, but their brilliance only carved deeper lines of discomfort across every face. No one dared speak first. Some gripped the arms of their chairs, others turned their wine glasses in nervous circles without drinking. Every tiny gesture betrayed the same truth. The entire room had just been stripped of control. At the center of that silence, Elijah sat unshaken. He needed no taunts, no retorts. His lips curved into a thin smile, not the smug grin of a victor boasting, but the quiet smile of a man who understood. True triumph lay not in applause, but in the lowered eyes of those who once sneered. That smile was not wide, not long, yet sharp as a blade slicing through silk. It made several avert their gaze, unable to face it. For those accustomed to looking down on others, being forced to bow beneath a quiet composure was more unbearable than any verbal strike. One man tried to speak, to patch the unraveling dignity, but his throat locked tight. Every word he might have uttered collapsed into uselessness before that silent smile. A woman drew in a deep breath, her eyes fleeing to the marble floor. Suddenly it was the entire room who had become the spectacle, while Elijah only sat there and let truth reveal itself. Elijah lifted his glass, raised it to eye level. He did not toast. He did not raise it for grand declarations. He drank a small sip, then set it down. The gesture rang like a gavel closing the chapter of the old order. Still no one spoke. The ticking of the wall clock echoed loud, dragging the tension into suffocating lengths. That silence no longer belonged to Elijah. It belonged to them, the ones sitting in a room that suddenly felt alien to themselves. Elijah leaned back against the chair, his gaze circling once. It was not a question, not a claim. But it hung there, suspended in the air. Who truly belongs here? And the narration rose, slow, lingering. Sometimes a silent smile makes people drop their eyes more than 1,000 words of rebuke. For in that moment, the real question was no longer whether Elijah belonged here, but whether they still had a place in the very room they once believed was theirs. The room pressed down like a heavy cloth across their chests. Those who had laughed the loudest, spoken the boldest, now sat quiet, turning their wine glasses without aim. The chandelier's light no longer glistened. It glared, exposing every wrinkle of unease, every crack in the mask of authority. A man whispered, voice hoarse, as though lost in the very hall he thought familiar. Who is this tradition really protecting? The words were never meant to carry far, yet in the silence they fell sharp, and several heads lifted with startled eyes. A woman adjusted her pearl necklace, her hand trembling. She had long boasted her family's membership stretched across 3 generations, but now that heritage suddenly felt fragile. If a black man could sit in the chairman's chair without speaking a single word, then the tradition they revered was nothing more than a veil draped over their deepest fear. Another member, hair white as snow, leaned back and sighed. He had once believed the grandeur of this hall proved an unshakable class, but Elijah's silence cracked that certainty. Perhaps preserving values was only a polished phrase for hiding terror of change. The clatter of silverware rang out awkwardly. Some tried to revive the mood with small talk, but their words stumbled. No one cared to listen. In every mind, the haunting question lingered. If what we've long been proud of is only illusion, then who are we? Elijah did not interfere. He gave no sign he heard their whispers, but his silence sharpened the question, forcing each of them to wrestle with themselves. He didn't have to topple them with words. He let them collapse under their own doubt. No one dared admit it, but their exchanged glances betrayed a new fear. Not of Elijah, but of the realization that the values they used to exclude others had never truly existed. A breeze slipped through the doorway, flickering the candles and casting shadows across the ceiling. In that wavering light, the once proud faces looked dusted over like statues crumbling into ash. And the narration cut in, slow, slicing. In that room, it was not Elijah who posed the question. It was they themselves. For sometimes the greatest fear is not losing power, but discovering the values you clung to have always been hollow inside. Elijah rose. Not hurried, not loud. The chairman's chair let out a low thud as he left it, an echo resounding in a hall accustomed to laughter and proud toasts. Every eye followed his steps, yet no one dared speak. He never turned back. He walked slow, shoulders straight, gaze calm, like a man leaving a place where his mission was complete. His half-empty glass remained on the table, a quiet mark that he had been here, and no one could erase it. The members sat frozen, eyes stiff. They could no longer meet each other's gaze, for each glance was a mirror reflecting the same truth. Their rule had not been broken by shouting or banners, but by a man who simply smiled and sat where they once swore he never could. The doors swung open, then shut behind Elijah. Outside, night air swept through the corridor, carrying the damp scent of grass and the cool touch of freedom. He breathed deeply, a thin smile still lingering. Inside, silence told heavy, like a verdict. No apology was spoken. No courage emerged to admit that their mockery had turned into a stain. But in the bowed heads, in the trembling hands clutching wine glasses, the truth carved itself deep. They had just witnessed an overturn that could not be undone. Elijah's footsteps echoed across the stone floor, steady as the ticking of a clock. Each step was not just sound, it was a reminder that history never stands still. Walls built to exclude might last for decades, but one man, one moment is enough to make them crack. He didn't need to look back to know what was left behind. He understood. Echoes are the strongest weapon. And tonight, that echo would cling to every soul in that hall, follow them home, haunt their sleep. The narration dropped low, lingering like a scar. How many times have black men been stopped at the door? And how many times have they returned, not only to enter, but to sit in the highest chair? If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.